Rob was my oldest friend. It's that simple. He's the person that I've known the longest.
Silence in Hollywood is rarely accidental. More often than not, it's currency, used to protect legacies, smooth scandals, and preserve carefully constructed images. But the silence surrounding Albert Brooks didn't feel strategic. It felt heavy. The kind that comes from grief, regret, and a truth that sits in your chest too long before finally forcing its way out. Albert Brooks and Rob Reiner weren't just colleagues or casual friends. Their bond stretched back more than 60 years, long before fame, before All in the Family, before directing careers and cultural influence. They were kids chasing laughs, writing jokes, imagining futures that hadn't yet learned how painful they could become. That history matters because when Albert spoke, he wasn't commenting from the outside. He was speaking as someone who had been there the whole time. When Albert finally shared what he'd witnessed inside the Reiner home, it wasn't polished or carefully phrased. There was no PR framing, no softened language. What came through was frustration, sorrow, and something close to exhaustion. He never denied that Rob and Michelle loved their son deeply. In fact, he emphasized it. But he challenged the idea that love alone could fix what was unfolding. Albert's point wasn't cruelty, it was realism. He described watching the situation slowly deteriorate while people stayed quiet out of respect, fear, or uncertainty. He said that over time, love began to blur into enabling, not because anyone wanted harm, but because no one wanted to confront reality head-on. He recalled a dinner months before everything collapsed. When Nick entered the room, the atmosphere changed instantly. Conversation stalled. Everyone felt it. But Rob reacted with hope, genuine, aching hope that this time might be different. Albert said that moment stayed with him because hope can be beautiful, but when it refuses to accept evidence, it can also become dangerous. Albert never said Nick was beyond help. He never said Rob failed as a father. What he said was quieter and harder to hear. Ignoring a storm doesn't stop it from coming. And once you hear that version of events, the story stops feeling like a sudden tragedy and starts looking like something that had been building for far longer than anyone wanted to admit.
So I'm still in that not believing it stage. I know what happened.
Rob stood up the moment Nick walked in, arms open, voice warm, acting as if this was just another family dinner, another chance to reset. But Nick didn't come to eat, or reconnect, or smooth anything over. According to Albert, he came with a demand, and not a small one. Serious money, the kind that had been used before to quiet crises instead of confronting them. Albert says the room went still. Forks stopped midair. Conversation died instantly. And then there was Michelle. When Albert looked at her, he didn't see irritation or exhaustion. He saw fear. Not sudden fear, familiar fear. The kind that had clearly been living in that house for years, unspoken and carefully avoided. That was the moment Albert says he couldn't stay quiet anymore. He pulled Rob aside, away from the table, out onto the patio where no one else could hear. No euphemisms, no soft phrasing. He asked his oldest friend a question that still haunts him. How long are you going to let him hold you hostage? Rob didn't get angry. He didn't defend Nick. He didn't raise his voice. Albert says Rob just looked depleted, like a man who hadn't slept in years, carrying a weight that never got lighter. Then he said something Albert says he'll never forget. If I stop, I lose him. In Rob's mind, pulling back meant losing his son forever. He believed his money, his attention, his constant availability were the last threads keeping everything from collapsing. What Albert believes Rob couldn't see was that shielding Nick from consequences wasn't preventing disaster, it was inviting it closer. This is where Albert becomes uncomfortable to listen to. He refuses to let mental health become a complete explanation. Not something to dismiss, not something to mock, but not a free pass either. Albert says he grew up around addiction, He's seen people struggle, spiral, recover, relapse, and he's blunt. Most of them didn't cross this line. He believes there was something else at play: resentment, anger, a bitterness aimed directly at the people Nick felt had defined him before he ever had a chance to define himself. Albert talks about growing up under the weight of the Reiner name, the Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, Stand By Me. A legacy so large it leaves no room to fail quietly. From Albert's perspective, this wasn't just about money. It was about tearing down a pedestal that had haunted Nick his entire life. And now, Albert says, he's terrified of what comes next. The legal strategy already forming. Reframing Nick as only a victim, shifting blame onto parents who can no longer speak for themselves. That's why Albert is speaking now, not for attention, but because silence at this point would let the story be rewritten by people who weren't there, and he refuses to let Rob's voice disappear with him. Albert isn't just a witness to the love inside that house, he's also a witness to the damage Rob quietly carried for years. That's the part making people uncomfortable now. Because according to Albert, this wasn't just chaos or confusion. There were moments that crossed into real emotional harm, and Rob absorbed it without pushing back. One story Albert shared silenced the room when he told it. It centered on Michelle Reiner. Michelle was the balance, the creative soul, the photographer, the artist, the one always trying to steady the ground beneath everyone else. Albert struggled just to say her name. Weeks before everything collapsed, Michelle called him unexpectedly. She didn't explain much. She didn't even say Nick's name. She simply asked about security systems, about safe rooms. Think about that. This wasn't someone living in a dangerous area. This was Brentwood, gated, guarded, locked down. Michelle wasn't afraid of strangers. She was afraid of someone who already had access, someone who knew the codes, someone who could walk in without knocking. Albert told her to change everything immediately. Change the codes. Bring in professional protection. Create distance between fear and reality. What eats at him now is not knowing whether she ever did. That question has never left him. He replays the call over and over, wondering if he should have gone there himself, wondering if doing more could have changed the outcome. The guilt shows every time he speaks. You have to understand how deep this friendship ran. Albert Brooks and Rob Reiner weren't just close. They were almost the same person split in two, same instincts, same humor, same timing. They built their careers side by side. Losing Rob didn't just take a friend, it took half of Albert's world. That grief has hardened into something sharper: purpose. Albert is tearing down the glossy Hollywood shield that usually protects powerful families. He says silence is what allowed everything to spiral. When Nick allegedly threw a chair through a window years earlier, no authorities were called, no official report, no hard stop. Why? Because you don't call police on Rob Reiner's son. You call a private doctor, a handler, someone who makes it disappear. That's Albert's accusation, stated plainly. Privilege didn't protect this family, it trapped them. There was always a cushion, always a cleanup, always another chance, until there wasn't. Albert didn't even hear the news from family. He learned through a business contact who caught emergency radio traffic. He drove straight to Brentwood, saw the lights, the tape, the barriers. He tried to push forward, saying he was family. It didn't matter. To the officers, he was just another man behind the line. That image stays with him. Now, with the trial set for January, Albert has made his position clear. He plans to be there, front row, behind the prosecution. He doesn't rely on theory. He relies on memory. And he's done staying quiet. They want privacy, and Albert understands that. But in his mind, silence has already cost too much. This time, he refuses to let it win. The siblings have asked for forgiveness, and Albert respects that choice. It belongs to them. They're grieving in the only way children can when they lose parents and a brother all at once. At the same time, they're trying to protect Rob and Michelle's memory without completely erasing Nick from their lives. That is an almost impossible line to walk, and they're doing it with grace. Albert is not walking that same path, and he's been clear about why. He isn't family by blood. He doesn't carry the same obligation to forgive at all costs. He was Rob's friend, and the friend isn't looking for comfort, he's looking for accountability. Albert says grief doesn't have to mean silence, and forgiveness doesn't mean pretending nothing happened. While the siblings are choosing peace, Albert is choosing truth. That choice has put him at odds with powerful people. He's openly furious about how the industry reacted, the flood of posts, the long captions, the carefully worded messages about heartbreak and legacy. Albert says many of those same people hadn't spoken to Rob in years. Some stopped returning calls. Others quietly backed away when things got uncomfortable. And then there were the ones who knew Nick was unstable, who whispered concerns privately, warned others behind closed doors, but still invited him to parties, still let him linger, because of his last name. Albert doesn't name names, but everyone knows who he means. He calls it performative grief, public emotion without private responsibility, a show after the fact. He isn't interested in sympathy posts. He wants answers. Who supplied Nick that night? Who drove him to the house? Who smoothed things over before, again and again? Albert wants every silent helper, every enabler, every layer of protection exposed. That's why this story matters. This isn't celebrity gossip. It's what happens when money, fame, fear, and unchecked behavior collide. It forces the hardest question of all. Where does love end and responsibility begin? Rob Reiner built a career on stories where love conquers everything. Films that taught generations to believe love survives all obstacles. Albert is standing in the wreckage saying something people don't want to hear. Love didn't stop this. Love made it possible. Love kept doors open that should have been closed. That truth hurts because it contradicts everything those films stood for. Albert shared a moment from memorial planning that broke everyone in the room. He was sitting with Jake and Roy sorting through photos. Rob on set, Michelle laughing, family moments frozen in time. Then they found an old photo from 15 years earlier. The whole family together. Nick smiling. Calm. Normal. Albert's first instinct was rage. He wanted it gone. To him, it felt like a lie preserved on paper. But the siblings stopped him. To them, that photo still mattered. That version of their brother was real once. That difference says everything. The family needs to remember the good. The friend cannot separate the past from what it became. Neither side is wrong. They're just carrying different weights. And the toll on Albert is real. He's in his late 70s. This kind of grief doesn't fade quietly. Sleepless nights, replayed memories, anger that won't settle. Rob wasn't just a friend. He was part of Albert's foundation. Albert says he's tried revisiting their old work. He can't. The screen goes dark. The laughter is gone. And the silence, he says, is louder than anything he's ever heard. That's why Albert keeps talking. Not for attention, not for revenge, but because silence already took too much, and he refuses to let it take anything else. Albert believes something else was taken too, something people aren't ready to admit. He says Nick didn't just take Rob from the world, he damaged his legacy. Try watching When Harry Met Sally now without the shadow creeping in. The joy is still there, but it's heavier. The laughter carries weight it never used to have. That stain isn't fair, but it's real. The most disturbing thing Albert shared had nothing to do with money or fame. It was about Nick's eyes. The last few times Albert saw him, something was missing. Not anger, not sadness, just emptiness. He described it like a building after everyone's moved out. Lights on, structure intact, but nothing inside. What makes that unbearable is Albert insists Rob saw it too. They were looking at the same thing and reading it differently. Albert saw danger, a moment to step back, to create distance, to protect yourself. Rob saw pain, pain that needed comfort, patience, love. That difference in interpretation is where everything broke. One man ran toward the fire, holding hope. The other warned to stay back, and the man carrying hope got burned. As the January trial approaches, Albert has made one thing clear. He's done staying quiet. He knows how this system works. He knows how narratives get softened, how mental health becomes a blanket explanation, how juries are guided towards sympathy instead of accountability. That's why he's speaking now. His message is blunt. Rob and Michelle were not villains. They weren't careless. They were parents who loved deeply, and that love made them vulnerable. That truth is uncomfortable, but Albert believes silence already failed them. Truth, he says, is the last form of respect. There's one detail he refuses to let disappear. Rob was afraid that night. Not calm, not drifting. Afraid. That matters. For the record, for accountability, for reality. This isn't revenge. It's grief sharpened into purpose. So when updates flood timelines and narratives soften, Albert wants people to pause. Look past the legal language. Picture a man surrounded by 6 decades of memories, jokes, and conversations that will never happen again, and understand why he won't stop talking. Because the real question isn't how this ends. It's whether anyone is finally listening,